When you hear the term Western yoga, there is no Western yoga. Western yoga implies that a Westerner created a yoga teaching and then spread it across the Western world, when that in fact is not true at all. Yoga was brought to the West by Indian men, by Indian yoga masters, and what we know of as quote-unquote Western yoga is the yoga that they created. The Yoga Connection with Zorananda is a deep dive into the world of yoga, exploring the rich history of tradition, methodology, and practices both ancient and modern. Follow along as yoga is explored through solo episodes to guest interviews to understand its vast reach around the world. Hello and welcome to the Yoga Connection. My name is Zorananda, and today we are diving into part 2 of my mini-series that I call the 4 waves of yoga within the Asana limb of Ashtanga Yoga. This is where the asana practice really starts to unfold. So in the first wave, there isn't much asana practice. It's more about the scriptures and the teachings and two kind of other important forms of yoga brought by Swami Vivekananda, who taught Raja Yoga, and then Paramahansa Yogananda, who taught Kriya Yoga, where Raja Yoga is called Royal Yoga, and it's more about the yoga of consciousness and him relating it to God and religious teachings. Then you have Yogananda, who brought Kriya Yoga, and he linked his teachings with Jesus Christ and Christianity to amass the following that he had. And then in the Kriya Yoga practice, it was much more about meditation and subtle breath work and seated practices rather than what we would now kind of know as a Hatha yoga practice or a Vinyasa yoga practice. And that's precisely what we get into in this second wave. And so when we look at the timeline, starting from the 1890s up until the 1950s, you have the first seeds of yoga being planted in the West, but you don't have the structured practice that we have now. And that comes along through 4 specific individuals. Now we're making the way for the second wave. And it all starts in around the 1930s with Krishnamacharya. So Krishnamacharya was a Brahmin back in India, and he was a part of this kind of like ruling class of a Maharaj. So a Maharaj is essentially like a king. So Maha means great and Raj means royal. It's just like the same as Raja Yoga. Raj is royal. And so you have this Maharaj who has his kind of kingdom in India at that time. And the Maharaj has his own Brahmins, who are these like kind of religious scholars. And one of his Brahmins has a disciple, and the disciple is Krishnamacharya. And at that time, Krishnamacharya was studying the Vedas and really only practiced the most traditional aspects of yoga. So it is strictly seated practices, postures. It's the core kind of 26 postures, and it's mainly about the austerity of sitting for a long time. It's doing seated twists. It's doing like wrapping your legs together in certain ways so that you can be in lotus pose and sit for a very long time. And that sitting for a long time is to endure the task of chanting mantras. So in the traditional yoga practice, chanting mantra is like the reason why you sit for a long time, because you need to memorize not only the mantra itself, but you have to memorize the cadence, the melody, and also the story that's along with the mantra. So one day, the Maharaj goes to one of his Brahmins, who's the master of Krishnamacharya, and he says, "You guys know the original yoga, and I have this Dutch gymnast who's teaching me acrobatics. I want you to melt them together to create a new kind of practice that I can teach to the Indians and like the people of my country." And that's where vinyasa comes from. And so the Maharaj was being taught this like gymnastics essentially by this Dutch gymnast, and saw that it was kind of similar to some of the sports that they had in India, but he just had this kind of light bulb moment where he said, "Oh, well, we can take what we have and we can blend it with what they have, and we can create something new." So then Krishnamacharya's teacher came to him and said, "Hey, you've been tasked to create a new program." And vinyasa came out of that. So this is in the 1930s, kind of goes into the 1940s. Then Krishnamacharya gains two students, B.K.S. Iyengar and Patabi Jois, and teaches them this new vinyasa style of yoga. And so Krishnamacharya, in the time of like, I think it was around 10 years, maybe 20 years, developed like a whole program and a whole set of postures, but then it expanded to like hundreds of variations. And so that's where we get like the warrior postures from, all the like standing, twisting, and like everything that you would see in a vinyasa kind of style of class. There's this like famous poster that you can find on the internet of like Krishnamacharya or B.K.S. Iyengar showing all the variations of like balancing postures to seated postures to inversions, scorpion pose, handstand, headstand, all the variations. It came out of Krishnamacharya. And so Krishnamacharya taught this to B.K.S. Iyengar and Patabi Jois, and then they created their own styles. So then you have Iyengar yoga, then you have Ashtanga yoga, which kind of complicates things because we're talking about in this whole series the origin of Ashtanga yoga, that it came from Patabi, or it came from Patanjali, as this like systematization of yoga as a philosophy. But then you have Patabi Jois taking the word Ashtanga yoga and adapting it to his own practice. And as far as I know, he didn't really actually teach the 8 limbs. He just kind of used that word for himself and said, "Oh, this is Ashtanga yoga. There's the primary series, and there's secondary series, and third series, and fourth series, and it has all these set of postures that you run through." And the story of B.K.S. Iyengar is actually really interesting, because when he came into Krishnamacharya's teachings, he was like well into his 20s, and he was really sick. I think he had either tuberculosis, or he had some condition that it it really hard for him to move. It made it really hard for him to just do normal things. And Krishnamacharya just forced him into all of these yoga postures and forced him to do all these crazy sequencing for years, and it ended up completely curing him of his illness and his like disability. And there are like famous videos of B.K.S. Iyengar in his 50s. So at this time, he would be in around the 1970s, doing some of the craziest things. And he was a big guy. He had like a big barrel of a body and these like skinny but strong legs. And he was doing some of the wildest things where he'd be like standing and he would back bend back into full wheel and then stand up into handstand and go from full lotus to handstand to like you name it. He just had this crazy strength and agility. And likewise with Patabi Jois, but in his own way as well. And so the interesting thing is they developed these styles, and then they were kind of commissioned to bring it to the West. And so it's at this point where yoga as a physical practice just catches fire and it spreads like crazy. And so if you were to compare the first wave to the second wave, the first wave, the seeds are planted. It has some influence. People really are intrigued by what yoga is and, you know, what the philosophies are. But they're just the seeds. And even though Yogananda was in his own right a master and really a great mystic and enlightened being and performed all kinds of crazy miracles, he only really affected a small portion of the population, right? He had 100,000 disciples by the end of it. But as soon as B.K.S. Iyengar and Patabi Jois come, their teachings spread through the country immediately. And within 20 years, they have schools all over the country, all over. It spreads into the UK. It spreads all across the world within a short period of time, but largely in the United States. And now they have amassed millions of students. And the thing that I want to make clear here is when you hear the term Western yoga, there is no Western yoga. Western yoga implies that a Westerner created a yoga teaching and then spread it across the Western world, when that in fact is not true at all. You can look this up, Google all of this. Yoga was brought to the West by Indian men, by Indian yoga masters, and what we know of as quote unquote Western yoga is the yoga that they created. And so it's really important to understand the root of all this and the history of all this, because the term Western yoga starts to twist into this negative pejorative that Western yoga is this root of cultural appropriation, and it's like it suddenly twists into white supremacy and, you know, social justice warriors and the likes of people will start to blame Western people, especially white people, for taking yoga and making it their own thing, when in fact it was Indian men who brought that teaching to the West and spread it through their networks. And what my teacher says is that all yoga is good yoga. And I have no problem with any type of yoga that is geared towards benefiting you as a person. Once someone starts to twist it for their own gain, then that becomes problematic. But you don't have to label it as cultural appropriation. You can just label it as that person's greed. And we see it all the time. And that's what we're going to get to in the later waves of how Westerners have taken this stuff and twisted it for their own and inevitably led to their own downfall. And so, what Krishnamacharya and B.K.S. Iyengar and Patabi Jois have done is they've taken these teachings that originally were very traditional and very basic, and they turned it into something new and exciting, and it worked. It worked so well that we still have those schools all over the world today. There are people that still celebrate and teach Ashtanga Yoga from Patabi Jois and Iyengar Yoga from B.K.S. Iyengar. And so that teaching of yoga to me is what should be sought out for. So now you have this arc leading from the first wave, planting the seeds of yoga within the minds of people. Then the second wave, expanding the growth of that yoga, seeing that the seeds have taken and germination has occurred. And then now you can grow this amazing network all across the country. And essentially what that did is it turned these two men into multimillionaires. They were charging, thousands and thousands of dollars to do the trainings. And not only that, they were franchising all of their work. And so if you were a teacher and you got a training from them, you'd go open up a studio and you would teach their style and they would get a stipend, whatever percentage. And so now you have not only these teachers who are going around and they're doing seminars and they're teaching trainings, but they're also making money from all the studios that are just operating. And so when people start to complain about, yoga and money being so closely tied to each other, it's really because of these two men. And, most, yoga teachers who, want to blame capitalism, it's like, well, I mean, you have to look at the originators of this, right? Like, yes, traditionally, if you were to go to India and you were to go to the Himalayas, yoga is viewed as this very personal experience, and you do it for seeking out enlightenment, and you do it for this path of seeking inner truth. And so the evolution of the teachings of yoga to lead to America and now turning it into this business, you can't blame the people within America who are born in the mindset of capitalism. You can't even blame, Krishnamacharya and his students for bringing yoga. It works out that way because that was the catalyst to spread yoga. Like, that's where you have to take a step back and you have to think, okay, in this second wave, the purpose of the second wave is to spread yoga as far as possible. And so the best way to do that is to do it in America, where they have a system set up where capitalism will allow that to happen. And a lot of people, in the kind of social justice warrior scene within yoga, they have a hard time comprehending this because they're so attached to their ideologies and they're so attached to the outrage of that idea where yoga should be free. And so you have to take a step back and you have to look at, okay, this was a design of something greater than these people. And that, in my understanding, that the consciousness of yoga itself at that time needed an outlet in order to expand, and that was the best way. And no matter what you do to look at that and to be angry at it, that's just what happened. And now look at the world. Look at what opportunity there is to experience yoga. Every single city has some kind of yoga studio. Every single country has the opportunity for retreats and trainings. You can go anywhere pretty much in the world and you're going to find a yoga studio. You're going to find yoga in some way. And to me, that's a blessing based on what had happened between the 1950s and the 1970s to spread yoga in that way. You know, does it kind of suck that it's tied to money? Sure. And to me, and this sounds like an excuse, but to me, that's the exchange that was needed. And that's the exchange that's appropriate in our world and the way that our mind operates in the Western world. That if we are going to go and participate in something, the way that we exchange in that participation is through money. And that's not the case at all times. There are plenty of places in this world where you can go to a smaller town or a smaller village on an island or somewhere, and someone's just doing like a barter trade for yoga. They're like, hey, yeah, like come to my yoga class and, you know, bring me some of your homegrown this, or make this for me, or do that for me. So it's important to have an open mind of how an exchange can occur and where. And in a large city that's operating pretty much like directly and solely on capitalistic monetary exchange, yeah, you're going to have to pay for the yoga class. But if you go to, say, like Salt Spring Island on the west coast of Canada, or you go to Bali, or you go to Thailand, you go somewhere where someone's just, you know, renting a space for super cheap, and they're like, you know what, just come. If you have money or not, that's okay. You know, that's what I did when I was in Thailand, when I was in Koh Phangan, and I was, you know, teaching yoga and in workshops and stuff. Sometimes I would do a workshop and people would just show up and they wouldn't give me anything. And I'm like, yeah, I don't care. Like, just show up and do your thing, you know. But here in Edmonton, where I'm from, the studio that I teach at, people have to pay, and they're comfortable in doing that. They have a job, they have a budget for things, and it's just in their consciousness that it makes sense. Oh yeah, I'm going to go to this studio that has utility bills and rent and other costs and overhead. They have to pay their teachers. Yeah, it makes sense that you're going to have to pay. And so I think what tends to happen is that people start to think that paying for an experience dilutes the experience itself. And to me, that is just, you're just operating in your own bias, and you're operating in this like critical way of engaging with that experience. And so for me personally, whether, you know, I'm paying for a class or not, I know it's up to me to show up in that moment, to dive as deep as I can, to examine what's happening in my body. And that's really what the whole process is about. So if you listen to interviews with Iyengar, he is so strong in that resolve that the yoga practice is to develop this deeper connection within yourself. And you'll hear that from any yoga master. And so it doesn't matter if you have to pay for the class or not. It's your responsibility to show up in that moment and to dive as deep as you can into that experience, even if it's just an hour class, even if it's just an hour and a half, that it's up to you to have the deep experience. And if you're going to let the way that the system operates, its bureaucracy and its capitalism, and affect your experience, then it's obviously showing you what you need to work on. Man, I think today is going to be just a day full of rants. Yeah, and I'm like, I don't have any notes on all this stuff right now. So I'm going off the top of my head for a lot of this stuff, but like this is stuff that I'm very well versed in. Like I've thoroughly studied who these people are, and you know, and so it's, I wouldn't say easy, but I'm able to go into a flow to kind of dissect all of this information as accurately as possible. And like, by all means, double check this stuff. And that's why I don't give like, specific dates or stuff like that. I just kind of give a general kind of time frame of, yeah, it's between these. Um, and there's also just so much more to discover, right? Like these yoga teachers have written several books, and it's worth diving into this stuff, especially if you're going to start taking yoga seriously. It's really easy to slip into this state of mind that you need to advocate. How do I want to say this? Um, that yoga should look a certain way. And I just don't agree with that. I think there's a good mix between looking at the traditional way of doing things and then looking at the modern way of doing things and then finding a bridge between them and seeing how those practices fit in your life. Like for me, my home practice is Ashtanga Yoga, and the way that it's designed just makes sense to me. And so when I look at, say, like a practice like Ashtanga Yoga from Patabi Jois, and I look at what they do, I just don't want to do that. I know my body right now, and I think I would hurt myself much quicker doing the Ashtanga practice than the practice that I do. And so when I look at that mix of like traditional and modern, I look at the modern side of Ashtanga yoga and I look at my body type and I'm like, oh yeah, there's just things with my body that would prevent me from going like in that direction. And that's totally okay. I'm not going to then find faults in that practice and then try to like out practitioners. I'm just going to look at the school and the practices that are going to fit how I am as a person. And so out of all of them, Ashtanga yoga made the most sense for me. And it's because of the elements that are within it, and it has this like beautiful mix of traditional and modern practices with it. Now we're getting into the next person who becomes the most problematic, and that is Bikram Chowdhury. And so Bikram was the one out of all of them that was like, I'm going to capitalize this as far as I can. And so Bikram creates Bikram yoga and creates hot yoga. And this is where yoga really turns into like performative yoga. And we see that coming out of B.K.S. Iyengar. If you watch his like old videos from the 1970s, 1960s, it's very performative. It's very acrobatic. And you can see the influence from originally from that Dutch gymnast, where there's like a lot of handstands, a lot of inversions, a lot of like TikToks where it's like he's going from downward dog, he's going into a handstand, he's going into full wheel back bend, and he's coming back and forward and back and forward and standing up. And likewise with Patabi Jois, right? It's a lot of very quick movements. It's going from downward dog to upward dog, and then jumping forward and going into forward fold. And so that leads to Bikram, and hot yoga. And rather than yoga being acrobatically performative, it's more like egoic performative. It's like, can you stay within this room that he cranks up to like 40, 42 degrees, and it's like so muggy, and like the humidity is 100%, and so it becomes this like performance of endurance. Can you do these postures and stay within these postures and kind of like outperform each other? And now you're turning people into like, oh, look at me and look at me do all these like crazy acrobatic things, to um, kind of turning against each other in the room itself. And where if like you were to kind of tap out and lay down in the middle of the class, he would chastise you, and he would like personally come up to you and like, no, 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 like if you can't do this, you have to get out. Like you, and then there was no getting out either. He would like force people to stay. And so then when you look at from B.K.S. Iyengar and Patabi Jois, there's this like weird abuse where they would have a stick, like this thin stick, and if you weren't doing the posture properly, they would like smack you with the stick. And as a Westerner, like we do know about like punishment and abuse from our parents and from teachers, and like what was that, like capital or corporal punishment, where like you'd get the paddle or you'd get the belt if you were being bad. And so that was also present in their world, when they were being taught by Krishnamacharya. If they weren't doing the postures properly, like they'd be hit with sticks, and then they would have to like, and then it would like jolt them into staying within the posture properly. And so they brought that into the West as well. And the thing is, people loved it. This is where like, within the social justice world, the people that protest all this stuff, and they look back at, Patabi Jois walking around with a stick and smacking people and being like, oh my God, that's so terrible. But at the time, the people that were in that class, they actually liked it. They liked being smacked, and they liked being corrected like that. But you don't hear about that. You don't see that, because these people want to look at these things and be like, oh, that's so terrible. How can you do that? It's like, yeah, you were in different times. I wouldn't like that, because, I wasn't raised in with a schooling that allowed that. Those people were. When those people were kids, if they were acting up in class, they were smacked with a paddle. They were smacked with a belt. They were punished. And so they had that conditioning. And so now when they're going to a yoga class, and this like barrel of an Indian man with a stick is going around and smacking them with a stick and correcting them, they have no problem with it, right? They're like, oh yeah, like I was doing this wrong. This is how I do it right. And so it's important to see the nuances and the differences in that, and how the practice has evolved to where we are now, where of course no teacher is going to be walking around with a stick hitting people. That's no. You're gonna like this, people are gonna complain, and the studio's gonna get sued, or like it's evolved out of that, and that's good. Like obviously that is a good thing. But at that time, that shaped how we start to see this like darkness start to come into the yoga practice, and we start to see how that like corrective abuse of like, you're doing the posture wrong, you need to do it well, you need to like straighten your spine, and it's done in this kind of like disciplinary way, to then now you have Bikram, who's been twisting that into sexual abuse. And so in the second wave, you have in the later years these three teachers starting to take advantage of their students, because they're taken by their wealth, they're taken by their power. Because at this point now, B.K.S. Iyengar and Patabi Jois have been in America for I'm gonna say like 30 years. As soon as we start getting into the 80s, they've been there for around 30 years, and they've amassed immense wealth, immense power. Everything that they do sell out. Every book that they sell sells millions of copies. They're at the peak of their power, right? And from what I understand, Iyengar didn't get caught in this. I think he stayed within this realm of like keeping a distance between him and his students. And he was married, he had a family, and I think he was older as well. So by the time this like the would be like the 80s and 90s, he was kind of going into his 70s. But Patabi Jois and Bikram kind of got caught into that corrective punishment turning into sexual advances, and so this is where the second wave starts to turn into the third wave. But I'm not going to get into the third wave just yet, because then that opens the doors for this whole other realm in the Western world. But now you start to see their practices becoming problematic, because people start getting super obsessed. They are super obsessed. They're practicing every day, all day, because not only are they being promised that they're going to have a super flexible body, super fit, super strong, they're going to look so good and so hot, that now they're starting to learn about the enlightenment stuff. They're starting to like, oh, like when I do my practice and I sit in meditation, I go somewhere, something starts to happen. And then you start to see how these teachers are starting to prey on that obsessiveness. And you start to see it a lot with Bikram. And when you dive into his story, it just reeks of greed. He is just the epitome of someone that's taking advantage of the whole system. Like he develops his like Bikram yoga practice, and it's like the 26 posture sequence and series, and then he tried to like patent it. He tried to say like, oh, I created this, and like no one else can do these postures, and if you're found doing these postures, you're gonna be sued. But there is this huge resistance, and I don't think he wasn't successful in patenting like this sequence. And what started to happen is that his like twisting into becoming a manipulative person and a controlling and abusive person started like pushing people away. So he would sexually abuse people and women, and a lot of his followers are starting, not a lot, but like little bits of his followers here and there would drop out and start their own practice. But because all they knew was the Bikram style, they would open up a studio teaching the Bikram style. And there's this huge, like, kind of like problem that started to come up of like him trying to sue everybody. And then it becomes very obvious that he as a person was motivated by money, and you got to think about the mindset and the mentality of, someone coming from India who was, born in poverty and, is talented in yoga because he started when he was a kid and, developed a strong practice with great flexibility, and then comes to America because he's really at the point of the golden age of yoga in the second wave, right? So in the second wave, he comes in at the perfect time, and he's like, oh yeah, I can just piggyback off of all of this and do something new and exciting, and like really take advantage of the wave of yoga that's happening over there. And it works. And he was selling trainings for $10,000, and he would sell out like a whole gym, and he would have 100 people sign up for his training. So, you can just imagine if he was doing a month-long training, um, he's making $1 million, and he would do that like every month. And so he was getting to the point where between his classes and his trainings and his seminars and his workshops, he's easily making up to $20 million a year. And, he did that for a couple decades or more, right? So, and he was known as this person that had like these mansions and Rolls Royces. He had like something like 20 plus Rolls Royces. And, so what we know of as Western yoga is from these people. And that's why it gets such a bad rap. And that's why when, someone like me, a Westerner, born in Canada, like fair skin, you know, and I get into yoga just synchronistically because I feel like it's embedded in my soul. And suddenly I'm being accused of cultural appropriation. I'm being accused of taking advantage of these teachings, and then I'm just doing it for money. And like, I've had several people come to me, like I have Shiva tattooed on my arm, and I've turned my name into Zorananda by adding Ananda to my name. And I've had friends and I've had people come up to me and be like, yeah, like, what are you doing? Like, you're culturally appropriating. But um there's a difference between taking the practice and using it to benefit yourself financially and creating a business, then adopting the philosophies and the teachings as a spiritual practice and a way of exploring a deeper meaning to your life. Like, you see what I mean? Like, there are plenty of people who, and this kind of aggravates me as well, that, you'll see people who are gymnasts or they were dancers, they were in ballet. And for whatever reason, their career in that sport ends. And then they transition to yoga. And because they have this whole history and this whole like back training from when they were children, they come into yoga as if they're masters. They have crazy back bends, they have crazy flexibility, crazy strength. They can already do all the postures. And then suddenly they do a 200-hour training and they go right into teaching yoga, and they make a business out of it, and then they become famous, and it's like they are just immediately recognized as these like yoga masters. But it's like that just doesn't make sense. And so when I look at, okay, well, what's the best thing that I can do as someone that has no history of gymnastics, no history of dance, and yet I'm being drawn to this yoga practice? What does that mean? And so when I look at my own history and what has led me to yoga, it was all through a foundation of inner seeking, and starting with meditation, starting with philosophy, starting with asking questions of who am I and what am I doing here, what my purpose is, and seeing that there is a thread of synchronicity that has led me to discover yoga, and not only discover yoga, but then have the doors open for the opportunity to discover a teacher and a legit Himalayan yoga master who then can bestow upon me initiations and practices. And that's the thing that's missing between the two, is that you'll have these gymnasts and these dancers who, they have a kind of like life crisis, identity crisis. They don't know who they are anymore because their whole identity was dance, ballet, gymnastics. And then suddenly that's taken away because they injure themselves, or they're just not good enough, and they find some yoga studio, or they find like a training or something, and they just hop right into it. But they don't find their yoga teacher. They don't find the yoga master. They just go into the program and come out, and suddenly they make their own thing of it and they become famous from it. Where then on the other side of it is, through synchronicity, you are brought into the world of yoga, into the traditional teachings of yoga, and you find a master that then can initiate you into it. And so, in my experience of being a yoga teacher and a student, is that I was brought into the more traditional world of it and was initiated by a legit yoga master who is my teacher now and always, Yogrishi Vishvaketu. And you can look him up. I'll post his name in the description. He's a brilliantly wonderful human being. He's just so kind and so loving and has created an amazing school. And I'll go more into that in the next video for the third wave, because it kind of like caps, or it leads into where we are presently and how we are in the fourth wave and what that means. And so, again, kind of like summarizing, going from the first wave to the second wave. The second wave starts well because it's piggybacking off of what Yogananda did and what Vivekananda did. But then in the tail end of it, it starts to twist. And where it starts to twist is it leads into cults. And this is why yoga gets a bad rap from a lot of people. Not so much in the yoga community itself, because people recognize the benefit of yoga. It's the people outside looking in. And it's, from a good portion of like Christians, you'll see a lot of like pamphlets, or you'll see a lot of flyers being like, like yoga is demonic and you should and this is what yoga does. Like, the funniest thing is how doing yoga postures opens you up to spiritual possession, and that demons come through, and that's why you're able to do those postures. And it's, to me, that's just the excuse to maintain like the Christian value, or to like maintain following of Christianity. But when you look at the history of yoga in the West, it's like it actually started and was rooted in connecting to Jesus Christ. That was like, there's these parallels, and that Yogananda was like, yeah, in India we love Jesus. It's like there's a lot of like yogis who are Christians. Like, we're actually kind of quasi Christians. We believe in Christ, and there's actually like a figure that we know of as Isha, who came from the north and like was seeking teachings and became enlightened and went back. And so it's like there's this funny like juxtaposition where it's like, yeah, in the yoga world, it's like Jesus Christ is like highly prized, and then in the Christian world, it's like yoga is just like shunned. And not in all Christian circles. Like, there are a lot of churches, like in Edmonton here, there are churches that like offer yoga classes and stuff like that. And so, but at the end of the second wave, you have this like darkness that starts coming in, and it's largely because of Bikram and Patabi Jois, who start to take advantage of their students and start to like exercise their power in being like sexually abusive to the women in their circles. Because if you like, that's primarily who shows up to yoga classes. It's like there are a lot of men, but it's like a lot of women come. Like, it's just, for whatever reason, it's a magnet for women. And then, if you're this like sexually suppressed Indian man who suddenly has all this power and you're surrounded by beautiful women, the temptation is so strong, and so, coming to the end of the second wave, Bikram is getting caught up in all these like scandals of sexually abusing women. And what that opens up now in the second wave is the introduction of cults. And you have someone like Osho, who came to America at around that time, I think in the 80s and into the 90s, and starting like that whole like that town in Oregon. Like, there's a really interesting documentary on Netflix called, I think it's like Wild Wild West. or Wild Wild Country, and it's all about Osho and his like partner Sheila, and like how Sheila was like this whole like the brains of this whole operation. And then it starts opening up this like whole thing of Westerners who start to take on the yoga practice and start to mix in like religious practices and Christian ideals to draw people in from the Christian world into their cult. Um, and now you have this whole new problem of yoga being used as a way of manipulating and coercing and controlling people. And now you have this whole problem, which leads to a theory that I have that the yoga teachings themselves are protected. And this is, I think, fundamentally why they were held very secretively in the Himalayas, is because of the power that is innate within it. And, you know, in the yoga teachings, you have something called the siddhis. It's spelled Siddhi. And siddhis means like power. It's like a phenomenal power that when you take on these yoga practices and you like really strongly commit to them, that there's something within your consciousness that starts to develop some kind of power. And a good example of how these siddhis show up is in the autobiography of a yogi. Yogananda has like chapters dedicated to different yogis that he meets and with different powers. And so the rishis and the sadhus and the swamis of India, like they know all this stuff, right? They know like how powerful yoga is. And they're like, hey, well, we need to keep this secret because we don't want it to get into the hands of people who are going to take advantage of it. But it got to the point where their numbers were dwindling so much that they had to bring it out and say, you know what, like it's going to happen. And we just have to have the faith that the positives are going to outweigh the negatives. And like, yeah, whatever, there's people in India that have cities and who are yogis and who go and take advantage of people all the time. There's a great book by David Gordon White. It's called Sinister Yogis, and it's all about these like stories of what a yogi or like really was. And he like really highlights the negative sides of it, but it is like it's enlightening because it's like, oh yeah, you know, like there is this opportunity for a utilization of this power. But then there is a stronger divine side of it, that it's really about not having these cities, and that even though you can develop these powers, that the powers are actually supposed to be directed to opening up this like gateway within yourself to come in contact with divinity. But you have these teachers who are developing this city of amassing great wealth. Like that's a power. Like amassing millions and millions of dollars every month. Like that's a power. Like they tapped into something. But because that power had to do with this great wealth, it brought in greed. And then that greed was like, oh, I get all the money. I don't need money anymore. And so I have this power. Like I can get any woman I want. And so you can see how it slips into this coercion, and then how that starts to inform Westerners who are like, I can do my own thing. I can create my own following. And that's where you start to have cults. And, but yoga has this like spell of protection. And this is my own thought on this. This is my own realization. I haven't like, I wouldn't be able to really find this in any book to like corroborate it. But just out of my own realization of, being a part of a cult at one yoga cult at one time without knowing it, but then realizing it and seeing how the downfall of it went. That when you are initiated into the yoga tradition, you are given the blessing of the yoga master to represent yoga in the world. And so in that blessing, you're given like a seed of that city to be able to influence people and to be able to do really phenomenal things with your body. You can do all sorts of shapes. You have all kinds of flexibility and strength, and you can really dive into this like presence within yourself. But I think within that seed, within that blessing, is a curse. And the curse is the protection of the teachings itself. And so that if at any point you abandon the teachings that you were blessed with to then take and create your own thing with, that curse slowly starts to poison what you have created. And I think that's what we see with Bikram, is that he was blessed with the teachings of yoga. He came to the West. He created his own thing. And because he abandoned his original teachings to create his own thing, the curse came in and slowly started to corrupt what he was doing, to the point where he was just totally convicted of the terrible things that he was doing. And then he had to abandon everything and move back to India and lose basically everything that he created. And then you start to see that in the Western world itself. You start to see that in these Westerners who do a training and they go, oh, great. They receive the blessing. And then they go, oh, yeah, I'm not going to teach what you taught me. I'm going to go teach my own thing. And then there we go. They take the curse rather than the blessing. And that's the important thing to really understand. And I think that can be said with anything, with any religion, any teaching. If you are not going to respect the teaching that you were trained in, and you are going to take that for your own means and to benefit yourself, then you are going to slowly poison what you're doing. And so I think you see that happen in the yoga world. And so now we're coming at the end of the second wave. We're kind of moving into the third wave, and the third wave kind of starts within, I would say, like the end of the 1980s into the 1990s, going into the 2000s. And then you have like this kind of like new rise of yoga masters. And then at the same time, you have this new rise of like Western influenced spiritualists and yoga teachers. So coming to an end of the second wave, we can see now the predominant influence of yoga as an asana practice, as vinyasa, as Iyengar, as Ashtanga, as Bikram, that there are these core postures that make up what the class looks like. And then it's directly influencing what we know yoga as. And so if you were to go to anyone, you ask like, oh, what's yoga? And they're like, oh, it's like this exercise, right? That's all they know it as. And it's because of the influence that these three teachers had on representing yoga, when it is so much more. And I think that was necessary as the next set of seeds to prepare the next generation of people into coming into what yoga really is, and that it's not just the asana practice. It has so much more to it. But we needed that foundation. We needed something to start to prepare ourselves for what the next levels of yoga is. And that's why in Ashtanga Yoga by Patanjali, You start with the yamas and niyamas, then you come into asana, then you come into pranayama, then you come into pratyahara and dhyana and dharana and samadhi. That you have to prepare yourself for the next stages of things. And so to have a strong asana practice where you're not only doing warm-ups, you're not only doing a seated practice, you're doing standing postures, you're doing warrior sequencing, you're opening up your body and you're opening up your nervous system to get to the point where you come back to your seated practice, you come into shavasana, and now you are prepared for the next levels of the practice, which is all internal. So you need that shaping of the external. And so when you look at what the asana practice was before Krishnamacharya and then what the asana practice is after Krishnamacharya, it starts to make sense that if you're wanting to include the rest of the world, you can't keep the asana practice as it was for Indian people. That the rest of the world, they have different body types, they have different temperaments. And so it made sense that a new form of an asana practice is created to then include everyone else. And so there was a lot of research done by these men before it was even brought. A lot of research done by Krishnamacharya and his group that like, oh, okay, if we're going to bring this to the West, this is the mind of the Westerner. This is the temperament of the Westerner. They knew what Yogananda had done and all the research that he did and the way that Westerners were just by his books and his teachings. Like you read his books and he talks about the Western mind. And when you listen to talks and you read the books of Iyengar, he talks about the Western mind. And they say like, the practice has to be this way for this type of people because that's what they need. They can't sit in a cross-legged position for 2 hours. Their mind is so busy that it aggravates them. The only way to quiet their mind is that you have to work their body. You have to exhaust them. You have to get them to the point of breaking where when they lay down on their back, they're gone. And when they sit up, they immediately can go into a meditative state. And this is the whole like yoga brain. And I'm sure if you've gone to a hot yoga class or even a good strong yoga class, you feel it. You do this incredibly difficult class, you lay down in shavasana, you're out like a light. And then when you come up, you're immediately in a different state of consciousness and you can feel it and your brain is just operating differently. And then you get up, you don't even know where you are. There's so many times where I've had such a crazy yoga class by like some of my favorite teachers and I come out of it and I look around and I'm like, I don't even know where I am. And that's because my brain and my body and my temperament is different than anybody in India. And so in order for me to have the capability of being seated and silent for a long time, my body needed to be conditioned. Right now, I can comfortably sit for an hour and meditate, no problem. But that took 15 years plus of getting to that point where when I was first starting trying to sit and meditate, my whole body was rigid. I immediately lost feeling in my legs. I'm achy and I'm in pain and I can't focus to, several years later where I can sit in full lotus and I can do my whole practice, come into shavasana, come up and meditate, and I'm easily meditating for an hour without even realizing it. And so that's the benefit of this new style of yoga. And I don't think it makes sense to complain about Western yoga and to say, Westerners or this like Western yoga is totally bastardizing what yoga was. And it's just, well, no, this is what was needed for this type of people. And this was researched and understood by great minds of yoga. The unfortunate thing is that in the later years of these great minds is that greed had corrupted them. And you kind of see that almost inevitably with great yoga teachers, with the exception, I would say, of just a handful, right? And so for me, still being young in this game, like even though I've been teaching for 15 years, I'm only 37. I do my due diligence to remind myself what it means to stay true to the authenticity of the teaching, and that not to make it my own. Like I have no desire to make my own school of yoga. There's already a school of yoga that I'm a part of that is brilliant, made by a legit Himalayan yoga master who's a PhD in yoga and knows the history and knows it even way greater than I do. And why would I take all of that and then go, oh, yeah, okay, well, here's how to make it better? I'm not in that position to do that. So that to me is what saves me from being corrupted later on, is that I'm in this state of humility and being humbled and being grateful. And so that I can continue being grateful for my teacher and for yoga and for the past yoga masters, and to stay in tune with the more authentic yoga masters. And this is why I gravitate towards Yogananda, because he was just a beacon of light for it. And he, even though he had his own dramas and he had his own controversies of people blaming him for things, he stayed within this like light of being a genuine yoga master up until the day that he left his body. So I'm going to end with this story because this is crazy. He was in a seminar with, I'm going to say hundreds, at least maybe thousands of people, okay? And he's in a panel with all these other figureheads of the United States, of India, and he's doing a speech. And this is right in his later years. He must have been in his 50s at this time. And he's talking about the self-realization fellowship and how it's grown. And he's talking about humanity and the state of the world. And he's talking about yoga. And right at the end, he says, "It's time for me to leave." And he just dies right then and there. And what that's classified as is Maha Samadhi, so the great release or the great enlightenment. And when he was brought to, I think, the morgue, his body didn't decay. So after 28 days of being in the morgue, because his followers, like, he directed something that he wasn't supposed to be, he was supposed to be left there. And through his like followers, they were like, yeah, just like keep him here and monitor him. And there's a letter in the autobiography of a yogi that is from the mortician that's like, yo, this is what happened. So after 28 days, his body didn't decay. It stayed soft and it stayed kind of like room temperature warm. It didn't become like cold and rigid. And there's something about that whole thing that is indicative to the type of power that he had as not only a human being but a yoga master. And so it's moments like that that tell me that it's important to have an austerity towards the lineages that you are initiated into. So it's like reading that book, hearing that story, that he basically died on command, went through Mahasamadhi, and was able to preserve his body. And apparently his body is still preserved, that the Self-Realization Fellowship still has his body, which, you know, who knows? But it's just through that tells me, okay, there's a kind of protection in place through this yogic energy that having a reverence for him and his lineage is also going to protect me. And so through Babaji and Lahiri Mahasaya and Sri Yukteswar and Paramahansa Yogananda and Anandamayama, and then up to Prem Baba Nath, who is Yogrishi Vishwaketu's guru, and then Vishwaji, that there are these beacons of light that I can surround myself with that are going to influence how I represent yoga. And that's going to prevent me from corrupting into the state where I go, oh, now I can create my own thing and I can create my own followers. And instead, I can go to my teacher, Vishwaji, and receive the wisdom from him of like, no. Don't have followers, have friends. These people are your friends. When they show up to your class, talk to them like they're your friend. Don't talk to them like you're this like superior and they need to follow you. No. We're all on equal footing here. We're all humans, and what you know and what you do is because of what you're passionate about, and that's not because you're in any greater position that they are in. And when I look at myself in that way, then it's much easier to respect the teachings that are coming out. So when I look at the waves of yoga and I look at the first wave and what happened, when I look at the second wave, what happened, this is what's informing me on what to do and what not to do. So I look at Yogananda, I'm like, okay, this is what I can do as someone that's a conduit for yoga consciousness. And then when I look at Bikram and Patabi Jois, I'm like, oh, this is what I'm not gonna do as a conduit for yoga. I'm not gonna take advantage of students. I'm not gonna take advantage of studios. I'm not gonna try to like twist it into something of my own and try to make millions of dollars. I don't need to do that. And then leading to what the third wave is, and how that starts to complicate the yoga world because of the introduction of yoga cults and who are the perpetrators of that. So that wraps up today's episode. I was just thinking while I was doing all this that after these fourth waves, I'm going to do a full episode on asana itself. I just wanted to kind of take this time to look at the history of what asana is and how it's been introduced to the world and what it looks like to us now, and then have like a full episode at the end that goes right into what all the original postures are, what they're used for, how to do them properly. But that will conclude today. Thank you for listening. I didn't mention this in the last one, but at the end of the episode, I'm playing my new song, You'll Be Missed. So if you listen to the prior episode, that's the song that you heard. And as always, go check out my Instagram, give me a follow, give a bunch of likes to my posts. Go to my music Instagram and check out my music on Spotify or YouTube or Apple Music. It's also on other streaming platforms. I'm going to have links to all this in the description. But again, my yoga Instagram is Yogi Zorananda. My music Instagram is Zorananda Music. And you can also check out my music on my website, zorananda.com. I think that's it. Thank you all for listening. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Enjoy.